pace and I can't anymore, or I'm trying to do more reps with this weight and I can't anymore, that's fatigue. Okay, it's getting harder to. Fatigue is not the same as failure. Okay, fatigue can lead to failure, but fatigue is not the same as failure. Okay, it's struggling to maintain a certain intensity. Yes?
Can you repeat the first part of fatigue that you said, that it's struggling to maintain intensity, right?
Yeah, struggling to maintain a given intensity. Jonathan?
Is this like different than, say, we're going for a 1 rep max? Say we're doing like a bench press, we fell out of 1 rep max. Is that different to we fell at 10 rep?
Yes, absolutely. Failing at a 1 rep max is a reflex. So failing on your 11th rep is fatigue. And that's what we're going to go through. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so different metabolic systems have different causes of fatigue. So I'm going to separate it by metabolic system. Okay, we're going to start with the ATP PCR system. Quick review. Where does this occur? Okay, rate limiting enzyme. Substrate. Okay. Intensity.
High
Very high explosive. What fiber type? Okay. How long can you stay in the system? Okay, so what causes us to not be able to use the system anymore? What happens? We run out of our substrate, PCR. So that's the cause of fatigue in the system, PCR depletion. PCR is our substrate, it's our source of energy. So when we run out of it, the system's done. That's fatigue. So if we're sprinting at our top speed and we run out of PCR, we have two choices. We can either stop exercising or we can slow down a little bit and shift into glycolysis. But this system's done. Pretty simple. It's not producing any byproducts. Lactic acid is not an issue here. Which also means you shouldn't be out of breath if you're in this system. There's nothing in the system that's causing you to be out of breath. The two things that raise your breathing rate, epinephrine and carbon dioxide, you're not going to get a huge epinephrine release from doing a 10-second sprint. And we're not producing lactic acid or carbon dioxide. So you shouldn't be out of breath if you do this. You can test that theory. Do a really good warm-up and do some 6-second sprints. 6-second all-out sprints to make sure you're in ATP PCR system. Make sure you have 3 to 5 minutes in between them. You shouldn't be out of breath. If you're out of breath after your 6-second sprint, what does that mean?
Was it your highest intensity?
It could be that you didn't go all out and you were in glycolysis. If you're out of breath after your sprint, it means you're in glycolysis. So either you didn't rest long enough or you didn't access your 2X fibers and this system. You're in glycolysis. Okay, let's look at fatigue and glycolysis. Quick review, where does this occur? Rate limiting enzyme? Substrate. Carbohydrates in the form of G6P, but we have to start with carbohydrates. Good. We didn't talk about how long we can stay in the system. We'll get to that in a minute. But we did talk about byproducts in the system. What's the byproduct? PFK is the enzyme. What's the byproduct? Lactic acid. So, we've said a few times now, lactic acid contributes to fatigue. You guys know by now I choose my words very carefully. Lactic acid contributes to fatigue. Lactic acid does not cause fatigue. It's the hydrogen from the lactic acid that causes fatigue. Okay, so 2 main things that cause fatigue and glycolysis. The first one is hydrogen accumulation. Hydrogen is from the lactic acid. Hydrogen is causing fatigue in 3 ways. The first way is as decreasing blood pH. So the pH is a measure of how acidic your blood is. Hydrogen is what makes acid. So if there's a lot of hydrogen, the blood becomes more acidic. The more acidic your blood is, the lower the pH goes. Okay, so blood pH is low because the blood has become acidic. The problem with that is a low blood pH inhibits PFK. What happens if we inhibit PFK? It slows down glycolysis. What is the purpose of glycolysis? To create ATP. Purpose of all of our metabolic systems is to create ATP. So if we slow down glycolysis, we decrease ATP production. If we decrease ATP production, we're going to slow down muscle contraction. What is the role of ATP in muscle contraction? Well, the ATP is going to bind to the myosin head, which causes the release of the myosin head from the actin. Then we break down the ATP, and it brings the myosin head up to 90 degrees. So if our production of ATP is slower, it's going to take us longer to get through that muscle contraction cycle. So it's interrupting your muscle contraction process. So what that comes across to you is, I can't continue contracting at this intensity anymore. I have to slow down. That's fatigue. Make sense? Okay, so if you slow down your ATP production, it's going to slow down your muscle contraction. Okay, another way hydrogen causes fatigue. Still a decrease in blood pH, but this time it's going to inhibit a different enzyme. It's going to inhibit glycogen phosphorylase. Glycogen phosphorylase is in charge of what process? Okay, so what happens to that process here?
Slows down.
We're going to slow. What is the purpose of glycogenolysis? It creates glucose. So if we slow glycogenolysis, we decrease glucose production, which in turn decreases what? G6P. If G6P decreases, what is that going to do to PFK? It's going to inhibit it. We already know that an increase in G6P activates PFK. A decrease in G6P will inhibit PFK. What happens if we inhibit PFK? And what happens if we slow glycolysis? And therefore, which by definition is fatigue. Okay, so these are two separate pathways that are being affected by the hydrogen. They overlap, but you need to be able to explain them separately because they're starting out with the inhibition of different enzymes. Questions so far? Okay, third way hydrogen causes fatigue. Hydrogen likes to bind to troponin. What normally binds to troponin? And what happens if calcium binds to troponin? Opens up the binding site so we can cross-bridge and power stroke. If hydrogen binds to troponin, troponin does not pull tropomyosin off the binding site. The binding site stays covered, which prevents us from cross-bridging, which prevents us from power stroking, which prevents us from contracting. Therefore, very difficult to produce force. Okay, this is going to lead to muscle failure. It's physiologically blocking your binding sites. Okay, this is called competitive inhibition. Competitive because the hydrogen is competing with the calcium to bind to troponin. Inhibition because it's going to cause muscle failure. It's going to inhibit muscle contraction. So hydrogen and calcium are competing to bind to troponin. If troponin has a choice between hydrogen and calcium, it will choose hydrogen. Troponin has a stronger affinity for hydrogen. So it will choose the hydrogen, and if hydrogen binds to troponin, binding sites stay covered. can't cross bridge, can't power stroke, can't produce force. So if you're failing at the end of your set or at the end of your sprint, it's most likely because of competitive inhibition. Questions on that? Okay. The other cause of fatigue and glycolysis besides hydrogen accumulation is inorganic phosphate accumulation. What reaction is occurring during exercise that's producing inorganic phosphate?
The breakdown of ATP.
The breakdown of ATP, which if we're exercising is happening a lot. So the phosphate is going to accumulate. The problem with accumulating the phosphate is that the phosphate inhibits the sarcoplasmic reticulum from releasing calcium. I'm going to say inhibits calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. What is the role of calcium in muscle contraction?
To bind to the troponin.
We need it to bind to troponin to open the binding site, right? So if we have less calcium available, we're going to open fewer binding sites, we're going to get fewer power strokes and less force production, which is fatigue. And the thing is, all these things are happening at the same time. Okay, these are not steps in a process. This is not causing this, causing this. These are all happening at the same time, the accumulation of hydrogen and the accumulation of phosphate. So not only do we have less calcium available for binding to troponin, but the calcium that is available has to compete with hydrogen for that spot, and it's going to lose. So the more of these conditions that you create by exercising at a high intensity, the faster you're going to fatigue, because we're being blocked from contracting. Yes?
What happens to the hydrogen after it binds to the troponin? Like, can you get rid of it during competitive inhibition?
Eventually, when you decrease your exercise intensity, then it will leave. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so fatigue and glycolysis, obviously a little more complicated than fatigue in the ATP PCR system. Please make sure you understand this at the level of detail I'm giving it to you. Yeah, this is another thing I'll guarantee will be on your test. Go ahead.
So for like when on an exam for competitive inhibition and for the accumulation of inorganic phosphate, you want us to write it in the same way that you wrote kind of like the hydrogen accumulation where like
Yeah, you'd have to write out an explanation for competitive inhibition.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't write it out, but you write it out. Okay, now the question comes in, how long can we stay in this system? Okay, there's not a number I can give you the way I can for ATP PCR system, because ATP PCR we know is our highest intensity. And there's a very small range of how long humans can stay at that intensity. Glycolysis is different because the range of intensities in the system, basically above your lactate threshold, is going to be in this system. Okay? So if you're barely above your lactate threshold, you can hold that for a while. If you're way above your lactate threshold, you're going to hold it for maybe 15 seconds. Okay? Barely above your threshold, you can hold for several minutes. So there's a wide range here. But if we're trying to put a number on it, let's think of an exercise that would put us in this system. How do you know if you're in the system? You're out of breath. That's your clue that you're in glycolysis, because this is the only system that produces lactic acid, which is going to create carbon dioxide, which is going to make you out of breath. So, name an exercise that would make you out of breath.
Running.
Burpees, squat jumps, mountain climbers. Okay, let's take squat jumps as our example. We all agree that that would make you out of breath. It's glycolysis for everybody. How long do you think you can do squat jumps for? 2 minutes? Somebody say 3 hours?
Let's go time it.
Who said 2 minutes? Who said 2 minutes? Rodney, who was it? It was back there somewhere. Who said 2 minutes? Jonathan, come on up. Riley, come on up. Who's gonna join them? We are actually doing this one. Oh, but you said you could do a minute. You going back on that now?
No, now there's nerves.
That should help you do more. Alright, you can do some warm-up squats if you want. You might want to take your glasses off. Jonathan, you might want to take your jacket off.